All right. So here we are with impeachment. Again, I want you to place, in your mind, is there room for Susan Collins to be sitting here? And what's amazing is you hear nothing about what's going on in the Senate. And there is no doubt in my mind that the intense viewing of this came from half a dozen to a dozen Senate offices, because they're trying to figure out, how do I justify this vote that I have to vote in support of Trump? Because remember now, if one Republican senator votes for impeachment, that person is going to F the rest of them. If Mitt Romney, that cowardly, snivelly coward, makes the calculation that his run for president in 2024 is incumbent upon him distancing himself from Donald Trump, he will vote to impeach. If he determines that there's no way I can win the presidency without Trumpistas in 2024, then he will vote against impeachment. Even if Susan, and if he was to vote for impeachment, Susan Collins would be dead in the water. I mean, how does Susan Collins not justify voting for impeachment? And if she votes for impeachment, she's going to lose 10% of her voting base on day one. They're in a very tough spot. So they're watching this and they're trying to see, maybe these witnesses will be ones that I could say like were crazy and really came off as completely wacky. Here is Ambassador Bill Taylor explaining this informal, irregular channel that he encountered.
At the same time, however, I encountered an irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking with respect to Ukraine, unaccountable to Congress, a channel that included then Special Envoy Kurt Volker, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and, as I subsequently learned, Mr. Giuliani. I was clearly in the regular channel, but I was also in the irregular one to the extent that Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, including me in certain conversations. Although this irregular channel was well connected in Washington, it operated mostly outside of official State Department channels. The irregular channel began when Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, Secretary Perry, and Senator Ron Johnson briefed President Trump on May 23rd upon their return from President Zelensky's inauguration. The delegation was as enthusiastic as I would soon become about the new Ukrainian president and urged President Trump to meet with him early on to cement the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. But from what I understood from the participants, President Trump did not share their enthusiasm for a meeting with President Zelensky. When I arrived in Kyiv, the actions of both the regular and the irregular channels of foreign policy appeared to serve the same goal, a strong U.S.-Ukraine partnership. But it became clear to me by August that the channels had diverged in their objectives. As this occurred, I became increasingly concerned. In late June, both channels were trying to facilitate a visit by President Zelensky to the White House for a meeting with President Trump, which President Trump had promised in his congratulatory letter of May 29th. The Ukrainians were clearly eager for the meeting to happen. But during my subsequent communications with Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, they relayed to me that the president wanted to hear from Zelensky before scheduling the meeting in the Oval Office. It was not clear to me what this meant.
Pause it for 1 second. So let me just make a couple of things clear here. When Zelensky is elected, and he was an actor, literally, I think, playing the president of Ukraine. And there was such response to the corruption. And look, Ukraine has not been a state that has been as successful as other former Soviet states and or, I guess, client states. And the regime that, or I should say the administration that was ousted or lost the election, was more closely aligned in some respects to Paul Manafort. And Paul Manafort had basically made this argument to Trump that, by releasing information on my criminal activities, they were undercutting your campaign. And so Trump is mad, and he sets up these two channels. Now, there's no reason to have two channels unless you want to make it like one is a legit channel and the other is doing something that we can't really be too transparent about. So we're going to have the front and we're going to have the real operation. And Taylor was brought in on the real operation only to the extent that they needed him to not make any issues about stuff. And so for a long time, he thought, he was under the impression they were working together. He didn't realize that this irregular channel had a different agenda. And that's where we are now.
Office. It was not clear to me what this meant. On June 27th, Ambassador Sondland told me during a phone conversation that President Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he, President Zelensky, was not standing in the way of investigations. I sensed something odd when Ambassador Sondland told me on June 28th that he did not wish to include most of the regular interagency participants in a call planned with President Zelensky later that day. Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, Secretary Perry, and I were on this call, dialing in from different locations. However, Ambassador Sondland said he wanted to make sure no one was transcribing or monitoring as they added President Zelensky to the call. Also, before President Zelensky joined the call, Ambassador Volker separately told the U.S. participants that he, Ambassador Volker, planned to be explicit with President Zelensky in a one-on-one meeting in Toronto on July 2nd. In that meeting, Ambassador Volker planned to make clear what President Zelensky should do to get the White House meeting. I did not understand what this meant, but Ambassador Volker said he would relay that President Trump wanted to see rule of law, transparency, but also specifically cooperation on investigations to get to the bottom of things.
All right, pause it. So now, what's happening is Taylor, we're watching almost in real time, okay? Not in real time, but he's retelling in real time. That he's on this call, and he's starting to this is not normal protocol. Why are we not transcribing this? What is Volker talking about? Volker says to other people on the call, the American constituency, guys, don't worry, I'm going to get explicit with Zelensky when I meet with him in person. In other words, you don't need to do that on the phone now. Okay? Now, Taylor's like, I don't follow this. Now, but everybody who hears Volker, who's in the know, they know what he's talking about. Oh, right. Okay. We're going to be on the QT about this because Volker's going to deliver the specific message. And what we're going to deliver, as Sondland says to everybody on the phone, we're going to deliver the sort of the background message, which is sort of the general gist. Volker will go in and tell him specifically what we're talking about. Continue.
Cooperation on investigations to get to the bottom of things. Once President Zelensky joined the call, the conversation was focused on energy policy and the war in Donbass. President Zelensky also said he looked forward to the White House visit President Trump had offered in his May 29th letter. By mid-July, it was becoming clear to me that the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. It was also clear that this condition was driven by the irregular policy channel I had come to understand was guided by Mr. Giuliani. In a regular NSC secure video conference call on July 18th, I heard a staff person from the Office of Management and Budget say that there was a hold on security assistance to Ukraine, but could not say why. Toward the end of an otherwise normal meeting, a voice on the call, the person was off screen, said that she was from OMB, and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending on security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened. The irregular policy channel was running contrary to the goals of longstanding U.S. policy.
Okay, pause it. Now, so understand, Mick Mulvaney is the chief of staff, acting. Mick Mulvaney is the head of OMB, acting. This is when Taylor starts to realize that, wait a second, not only is the meeting conditioned upon this stuff, so too is the actual money that has been appropriated by Congress to go to Ukraine to help them fight the Russians. And he's starting to freak out, and he's starting to realize that there's more specificity to this request than just like get to the bottom of various things.
Rule of law.
Rule of law. Be good. He's starting to find out what be good means. All right, let's play a little more.
There followed a series of NSC-led interagency meetings, starting at the staff level and quickly reaching the level of cabinet secretaries. At every meeting, the unanimous conclusion was that the security assistance should be resumed, the hold lifted. At one point, the Defense Department was asked to perform an analysis of the effectiveness of the assistance. Within a day, the Defense Department came back with the determination that the assistance was effective and should be resumed. My understanding was that the Secretaries of Defense and State, the CIA Director, and the National Security Advisor sought a joint meeting with the President to convince him to release the hold, but such a meeting was hard to schedule, and the hold lasted well into September. On July 9th, in a phone call with then Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs Fiona Hill and Director of European Affairs Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman at the NSC, they tried to assure me that they were not aware of any official change in U.S. policy toward Ukraine, OMB's announcement notwithstanding.
All right, pause it. So, okay, basically what we just heard is all of the process that came after that, when everybody at these agencies who are all wondering, why is this money being held up? And everybody's looking around the table to everybody else, metaphorically, and saying like, wait, is this your agency doing this? No, it's not us. Is it you? No, it's not us. We all agree, right, that this money should go to Ukraine, that it's all consistent with stated U.S. policy that is a function of Congress. They appropriated this money. And everybody's looking around going like, what's the holdup? They don't know. And ultimately, Taylor realizes that the holdup is a function of these irregulars who are basically being guided by Rudy Giuliani. Now, with that established, there's one more part to this. How does Bill Taylor comes, we've established the part in the first testimony that we just played, that how Taylor came to understand, A, that there was a dual track in approaching Ukraine, that B, the second track was working basically to get the deliverable, which was a statement that the government of Ukraine is investigating the Bidens and that their own involvement in 2016 election. And then Taylor starts to realize they're holding up not just dangling a meeting with Donald Trump, they're also holding up the congressionally mandated, appropriated $400 million worth of defense funds that Ukraine desperately needs. So he puts all of this together over the course of several months. He then drops this bomb in his testimony. And this bomb is actually one that the Democrats are following up on. Apparently, after he gives his private deposition in October, he has a member of his staff say, I have something to add to this that I'd never told you about before, and just did not seem relevant to me, but now is a lot more relevant. And this is the big bombshell. Democrats are meeting with the person that he's going to be talking about, I think today or tomorrow, in private and taking a deposition. I have a feeling we'll see that person in public at one point. But here is Taylor basically dropping the one new piece of information. A lot of this stuff was just in his personal deposition, his private deposition. Here is the big piece of new information that I think was so key.
The United States gave the Ukrainians virtually no notice of the release, and they were livid. Although this was the first time I had seen the details of President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky, in which he mentioned Vice President Biden, I had come to understand well before then that investigations was a term Ambassadors Volker and Sondland used to mean matters related to the 2016 elections and to investigations of Burisma and the Bidens.
Pause it. Now, this is clip number 7, right? Okay. All right, here we go. Now, he just said he saw the readout from the July 25th call, but he had basically pieced things together prior to that.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv.
Pause it now for 1 second. Now understand, okay? Yermak is the assistant to Zelensky, who's the president of Ukraine. This is the day after Trump has been on the phone with Zelensky saying, I want you to do me a favor, though. Leaning on the stuff generally, has his capos essentially deliver the specifics. And so Taylor is separated from his staff. Staff member is with Sondland, who is the EU ambassador, but been messing around on this irregular channel.
Staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. At the time I gave my deposition on October 22nd, I was not aware of this information.
Okay, so there it is. Sondland's assessment of what Trump thinks about Ukraine is nothing. He just cares about the investigations into the Bidens. There's a lot of information in what he just delivered that undercuts all of the arguments that the Republicans have tried to offer. One is nothing happened. Well, it's quite clear, and they had no intention of doing it. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians were ready to make the deal. We'll make the deal. They have no choice. They have no choice. And at one point, Kent is asked, would it be likely, and I don't know if we have this clip, when Kent is asked, would the Ukrainians pretend that they were not intimidated by Donald Trump to avoid pissing off the United States? And Kent's like, yes. In fact, I talked to a reporter last night at MSNBC in the green room. Simon, I can't remember his last name, but he is a reporter for PBS who spends half his time in Ukraine. He said, absolutely. Of course. Of course they would be. They'd be very nervous about it. They were prepared to move. Donald Trump did not care about corruption. He cared about getting this information about Joe Biden. How do you respond to this if you're the Republican Party?